Hi. So I want to start this project by saying that I started scripting for it back in extremely early November, which is only going to become more relevant as time goes on. We are now in January. I'm going to probably be doing a piece of this project about a month, and this month was for the blouse. Now to walk you through and explain kind of what the whole project is going to be. The ultimate goal is going to be to have two distinct outfits. One is going to be a 1940s civilian's dress for a white mage from Final Fantasy, and one is going to be her military uniform. We're going to cover a character arc, or the archetype for the previous Final Fantasy games. That is, before they started having names and identities around the time when the white mage class was combined with the summoner class. And this is to both play with the archetype and see what someone who doesn't really have combat skills and who only serves a support function can do in instances where it doesn't feel like those skills are supportive to situations that would need it. And that is partially why we are doing the 1940s, because there was a lot of that going around at that point in time, as you might imagine. And that's what I want to explore with these characters is, and this is going to be going for my projects going forward, by the by. We will make a character archetype, and then create some clothes based around that idea, plus history, to see what we can learn about these ideas when you put them together. The important thing I want to get out of this specific project, this one, is how can you support others when the traditional way of supporting them isn't open to you. We're going to explore the myriad ways that this is going to look for this character. I did reference that on the latter half of this project, it is going to be based around joining the military around the time of the WAC. This is also just a fun way to explore World War II history, full disclosure, guys. It's not, it sounds super serious and dour, but that's because of the time period we are currently existing in, and the time period that the character, who going forward will be calling Ren Morgan for, ease and convenience, is going to be going. This way we don't have to just call her our precious white mage, our white mage, our mage. This way it has an idea, it has a character, she has an identity. Now, full disclosure, I did, around the time I initially started making this project, start playing Final Fantasy XIV, and that might have fueled the obsession again. This is not the first time I have talked about white mages, even on this channel. The first project I ever did on YouTube, Mage Historybound. Now, you've already heard a couple ways it's going to differ for this project. There's going to be a couple more. We are focusing just on the 1940s. That is going to be our main and primary focus. We're also going to be exploring how and why certain fashion choices were made at the time a little bit more deeply than we did the first time, because I was spreading myself out between two different time periods when I did that initial one. Also, I have about 3 years of experience on sewing now, so hopefully it'll look a little different. And it's to find out how we can get joy in sewing even when we're not necessarily an expert. And if you take nothing else from my channel, I want it to be that you don't have to be an expert to enjoy things. You are allowed to enjoy things, even when this is just a hobby. Because hanging around in this sort of space, imposter syndrome can start to run rampant. Trust me, I know. That's not what we're going to be doing here. We're just going to be exploring concepts and making pretty outfits while we do it. With that being said, if you've stuck around this long, Hi, my name is Caitlin. I am called to a mentor on all the things. If this or any of my shorts that have brought many of you to me interests you and you are looking for more information, please do feel free to join us on this adventure on all of the things, because we'll be doing this fairly regularly. I got a comment on one of my shorts that said, "So do you just wear pajamas and give advice on how to thrive?" No, but yes. I don't really. T-shirt and leggings a lot of the time when I'm not in vintage dress. But I promise I wear people clothes sometimes. The idea is, and the ethos of Call to a Mentor in general when I started it back during the pandemic, was I wanted to take the idea of fiction and fantasy and the many, many subgenres therein and explore what I could of humanity with it and generally just have fun. I want to see what we can learn about ourselves, about each other, and about history through this concept. So, that being said, let's start talking about the project.
So first and foremost, we have our original design. This was the first concept art we did for it. And originally what I had was this neckerchief that was also going to be used as a hairpiece. I still may come back to that one because I do love that design a lot. For the ultimate project, it didn't quite flow with the image I ended up going with. Same with this blouse. I am in love with this blouse in concept. When I tried to pin it in theory, it didn't quite look the way I wanted to, and not in a trust the process kind of way. In a not quite where we're going sort of thing. In the initial design, I made the decision that I wanted to have elbow length sleeve because I saw a lot of them were about that length. But just as many were full length, and that seemed to foreshadow a little bit more. We're going to get into that when we see the final design. You'll also see the diamond design going along the cuffs. We did end up moving those down, as you'll see in a second. You also see herbs and item packs at our hips. I'm thinking of how Final Fantasy had a lot of these things going on, and how this is a world with magic now, and magical items, and that's the other thing I want to explore as far as world building goes. How does that impact something like World War II? How does the fashion change? How does the logistics itself change? What can be done for people now with that information in mind? That being said, this ended up being closer to the civilian draft outfit. So the bodice ended up being a little bit tighter. I still kept the healing items in the pocket. I moved the sleeve downward, as a lot of the outfits were down to the sleeves, and this is going to be slightly more of a winter outfit, so I also wanted to keep that in mind. So what we have here is the blouse, which is what we finished this month. There's going to be an under blouse in there, but you can only just kind of see what we're going to get into that. I did a neck scarf, which is going to use up some of our spare fabric, so we don't have too much fabric waste going on. So as you can see, this one reads a little bit older than this one. A big portion of that was why the fashion wasn't as youthful, yet a lot of the fashion mandates required some sameness, some conformity in regards to what could be used and when, especially because, as we will be talking about in the mock-up, there were restrictions on how big and voluminous your sleeves were, the lengths of your clothing. There were just very specific things you could and could not do that we are already bending the rules with just by having this and having an excess pocket. Which, again, we will get into at the mock-up stage. While this one, I think, reads a little bit more directly and easily identifiable as Final Fantasy, it does lean a little bit further away from the period. The pants do look a little bit more period, but that is just a slight waning in my drawing skills, more so than it is. These are supposed to be the same pants, different pose. But while I do explore it, I do want to honor the time period we're looking at here. So the next scarf ended up getting closer to this. She has a beret and a hairnet rather than a headscarf. That isn't to say that these scarves were never a thing, just that they weren't quite as common as other head coverings. That is also why I did less color detail along. That is why I did less color covering here than here, to try to keep it consistent with what might have been in someone's wardrobe even in a fictional and fantastical version of history with this, while still honoring some of the whimsy that was inherent to the period. And most of our interpretations are going to be balancing historical fact and whimsy, and the idea that this is meant to be incorporated into a generalized wardrobe, and playing with that idea. So effectively, this is going to be our mock-up fabric going forward. There is, I think it's about 6 yards total of this, and I got it on sale. And it is honestly the nicest win I've had in a while as far as fabric goes. I also learned my lesson from that last time I talked about in my TikTok, where get way more than you think you need, because what if it gets discontinued? Which happened. I like this fabric because it's, you know, it has a vintagey type feel, while still being tongue-in-cheek and semi-modern enough in its design that it doesn't look like I'm necessarily trying to be vintage. I'm trying to honor vintage, not necessarily adhere to it, which I like. And it's got a nice weight to it for being a cotton blend. It's when I pick it up, it's got a decent heft to it, and part of that could honestly be that it's 6 yards. But it's nice enough that I can make shirts and clothing out of this without necessarily having to worry about hyper layering it. So these are our 3 fabrics that we have going on for this project. There is a 4th set of fabric, but that was for the blouse. And I will walk you through the logic of the blouse when I put that on towards the end of the video. But first I want to go through these 3 and acknowledge the 4th, which should be coming a little bit further on in the project. Generally, once we finish the blouse, there will be a 4th one as well. We're going to talk about that in just a second. But I really like this nice steel gray for her pants, and if I have enough to maybe do a jacket as well, because the 1940s were big on match set pieces to make a fabric ration last as long as humanly possible. I like the idea of it being this color because this was such a common color in period, and I want to explore. This one, for when Wren goes off to fight the great evil, I like this really creamy, warm white with the red and the brown mixed in, because I like the idea of the red, white, and brown for this uniform set. Specifically this very deep brown that this pinstriping is. I feel like that will give off the vibe of still being a white mage, while also seeming like it could be part of a formal fighting force. Which brings us to honestly my favorite and the thing I'm most excited about working with. This double-sided twill. I saw this and I fell in love with it, and I knew instantly that this had to be our white mage equivalent cloak. I haven't quite gotten through the process of figuring out how I'm going to do this one yet, how that's going to look in this period. But I knew I didn't want Red to be a nurse specifically. That didn't feel like that acknowledged all the other 238 other roles women could have in the military at the time. And I feel like there needs to be an acknowledgement of the other roles, because so often in history when we hear about women in these roles, It's to discuss them in a nursing capacity. But yes, speaking of, I am going to be getting a brown suiting, much like this one, for this uniform piece. So that's one thing I want to keep an eye out for, is finding a sufficiently warm yet dark brown for this.
So the shirt's done, and I'm very excited about that. There were a couple variations I did, and there were a couple that I made to remake a second shirt to make it more historically accurate. But structurally, I like the way this works, especially for the fictional character we're building that incorporates elements of the white mage from Final Fantasy and this theoretical 1940s in which a white mage could exist. I did allow for some of their aesthetics to creep in where I could, and with the final blouse I will likely be including more. Like, I want the diamond motif going up the chest up to where the collar point starts, just like many of the white mage robes managed to do. I also want to put it along these sleeves, but I'm debating that now that I've done the proof sleeve. That was the original idea. But now I want to play with that before I say, oh yes, definitely. A big reason why I didn't do it this time was, one, I wanted to just get the structural mechanics of the shirt down before I made any decisions one way or the other. And the other is because I may want to play with this pattern again in a different way, but I wanted to make sure I got the main way down first. So this is the casual blouse. Now, to allow for bloating and changes in size in the real world, to allow for comfort and ease for me as much as possible while keeping the generally more fitted aesthetic.
Hi, it's Editing Caitlin here. I'm cutting in here because the point I was about to get into had a little bit of a hiccup to it, in that I was reading fashion from much later in the decade, i.e. post-war era of United States fashion, rather than the current time period. I will put images up on screen, as you can see, but during the war, clothing was much more loose-fitting and military-inspired than what I had described in the initial video, where I was conflating just as New Look was getting popularized, and after, when I was describing the cuts. And I wanted to take the opportunity to take full accountability for that little hiccup, because yes, compared to the modern era in which we now all live, clothing was in fact much more structured, much more fitted than most are now. I am recording this in a baggy t-shirt that would never fly in the era. And you are looking at me in leggings. Would never fly at that point in time. But for its own era and the times surrounding both before and after, clothing was much less structured. Every piece, due to rationing and due to a variety of other factors, had to count. You had to be really, really economical in how you used everything, which meant there wasn't a lot of room for waste. And the other thing is, clothing had to be significantly more durable than really we had to worry about post-war. You had to be able to get them dirty and be able to have them endure a tear and actually be able to fix it. And the style was a little bit more boxy than it would become later. So I wanted to cut in and show examples of that here, and then we will get back to the story. Yes.
So I put them at the seam, which structurally, we'll see how that lasts. I reinforce them to be safe. But then it pulls it nice and tight in so that it sits comfortably and I can control how loose or tight it is at any given time. I like that adjustability. I like having that kind of range. So, and that's something that comes in and out of styles throughout the period, throughout most periods, honestly, is some form of variability measures like this that make it a little bit easier. So that was something I wanted to try. Let's see, where else did I verify? I did shorten it to end at the waist a little bit because I want to wear this with a fairly high-waisted set of pants, and I didn't want that bulk right around here because I like the idea of not having to tug it super tight, especially if this theoretical character is going to be wearing a belt and equipment and other stuff all along this area. I want them to have as smooth of a spot as humanly possible that can go over and under the bow if the bow would even be in the way and can't just be crushed flat. But I do have a good range of motion on this, which is good. I live in the South now, so I don't really need all the heavier layers that are often associated with both sets of uniforms. As I referenced when I talked about my fabrics, I do have a heavier fabric coat, but that one is obviously going to be for conditions where I need it, and it's not necessarily going to be a constant within the costume, which is why the black and red red and white diamond motif needs to come back in and out on the lower layers so that I have that variety and I have those options. That being said, depending how much fabric I have left over, I may do a waistcoat too. Yes, this project just keeps getting larger and larger. I have plans. Again, this is going to be my big project for the next little bit. I am pulling both from the stories of field medics and from generalized civilians for this specific outfit, because both were important. Both aided the war effort in their own way. Now, the other reason I wanted to have the adaptability measure on the back is because, especially towards the end of the war, there is some indication that rationing gets tighter and tighter, to the point where you're not really, think of it like mask mandates. You're not being forced necessarily anymore unless you're in certain regions. It gets tighter and looser depending where you are in the US after a certain point. But the ration system makes it so that it's debatable as to whether you'll be able to get any resources if you or your neighbors do not grow or feed the thing in your yard. Which was a flaw and a trick of the rationing system that was a problem, was that you could absolutely have the tickets, but it's debatable as to whether the thing you want is even going to be there by the time you get there. And that was something that had to be accounted for. So when a resource is heavily restricted like that, and stress, hormones, all these other things that are going to affect the body in a variety of fun and fantastic ways, I kind of wanted the visual storytelling of having something in the back that accounts for that. So on either side of me, I have the mock-up for the initial pattern I did, wherein I realized I loved the pattern, but maybe not for this project. And then I have the finalized shirt, which lined up a little bit more with where I wanted to go, and helped me with the foreshadowing process and really figuring out the characterization for this particular character and why she needed to skew a little bit older. That being said, I'm going to try on both for you while wearing the white mage pants from the first costume. This is to explain what the thought process is between this one and the main one. Now, I must say, I genuinely love this pattern. I just don't love it for this project. It plays a little bit fuller at the sleeves than the traditional period is supposed to, even allowing for the volume extras that were allowed for plus size patterns. So I was a little bit skeptical at that, but I knew I wanted the triangles at the cuffs, and that wasn't working with the sleeve type. It wasn't showing the way I wanted it to show. And same idea with the triangles going up the top. They didn't line up quite as cleanly as I wanted them to, so what I did was I accepted that this one's just going to be a blouse, which is why I do wearable mock-ups rather than regular mock-ups. Because then, worst case scenario, I have a cute new shirt. And I can just keep wearing it as that, and no one really has to know. But yeah, the other thing I did to make it more fitted, and this is dubiously period. Keep in mind that's dubiously period on this one. Some patterns did do things like have little bows and ties at the back, but it wasn't commonly done. It was pin tucked and pleated in a way that I didn't do for this shirt. So I wanted to skew a little bit more closer to time period accurate, especially where we were already making allowances for things like trim in regards to the pattern. So while this is a great shirt, this isn't great for what I wanted it to do, which is where we're going to talk about where we ended up with the final project. So first and foremost, it is obviously now skewing much more red fair than 1940s, but I do feel that there's a way we can make that work. The necessity of making the sleeves a little bit a fair amount longer, about double the length, and adding the trim adds a little bit more of a magical flair than the pragmatism of the 1940s. I feel that we can use other shapes and other ideas built around the fashion of the time to make this still work without completely undoing and reconstructing the whole project. There's a way to blend the two in this one instance that we can make this work. And if not, then we go back to the drawing board and we do it again. But let's work with what we have first. But I love the mystical feel of this shirt, which feels very appropriate to the fantastical world that we are building in regards to this concept. I feel that even in a time where a dark evil would rise, having this small, humane amount of whimsy, this specific and intentionally chosen anachronistic having this small anachronistic period piece could work to our favor to the world building and storytelling of what we're making here. Let's explore and see what other elements we can add that will both make it part of the same universe, similar to our own time period, and its own thing all at once. Let's talk about costume design. Okay, so no one laugh at me, but I have a third option. I know I just spent a bunch of minutes praising that one specific one, and I still love it, and I'm definitely going to use it for something, but I found something that fits the vibe even better, and it wasn't even made for me. This is a modified version of my partner's mock-up that I made for a shirt I was making for him. Cut back to my size. I'm mad at how much better this works for what I was going for. I just need to adjust the cuffs, fix the collar, and obviously add the buttons. But I cut it to my length and the proper size, and it's sitting the way I wanted the first one to. So once I add the trim, this would be perfect for what I wanted to do in the first place. So this is great. This is probably what we're gonna go with. So my whole goal, I didn't want to have to recut the shirt if I didn't have to. Because I wanted this to be as minimal a waste of project as humanly possible, i.e. I bust through stuff I have here outside of what I ordered specifically for this project, and then use that to its absolute limit. This works to expand on that concept even further, because this is a mock-up I made about 2 months ago that I didn't know what I was going to do with, but I kept. And this works so well, and this lets me use the remainder of the red fabric for the trim. This lets me use the shirt. This lets me keep the other shirt without touching it, because I really do like how that came out. This is just a win all around. I'm real happy about this, actually. So, this is why we also keep our mock-ups, because you never know when you're going to repurpose them. With that being said, what comes next? So what comes next is we're gonna wrap up stuff on this shirt. Hopefully I can get that finished within the next 2 to 3 days so that I can stay on schedule for when I wanted to do these postings. And then we move on to the next stage of the project, which would be the pants. And actually, speaking of digging, I found, because I did a historybound of the curator from the Dark Pictures anthology, and yes, it's the 50s, it's slightly out of date, but also I feel like if we tweak this pattern, because the patterns didn't change that drastically, we weren't at that period where it was every couple months, it was a completely different pattern. I feel like we could tweak this one into a 40s pattern. I'm distinctly not, because I am distinctly not doing pants, and that is on purpose. Ignore the skirt, I was working. Now seems as good a time as any to discuss the aesthetic ethos of this costume and why things are going to be the way they're going to be. The short answer and the best way I can explain the general vibe we're going for is whatever would make the tiny mustache man the most angry. And that extends to anyone who would happen to follow him then or now. And how that plays in is every detail that we're going to be considering is going to be counter to whatever their guidelines were. So the most notorious example, and if you've spent more than 5 minutes on TikTok, this is the one that you're going to see the most, is the red lipstick. But to bring that ethos into the modern day, we're also going to be including a mask. Because what is the point of this project if we don't explore how these things work in the here and now times? Because unfortunately, in the words of John Mulaney, there's Nazis again. And I don't care for these new Nazis. So we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna do whatever we can to reappropriate the time period they fetishize the most and reclaim it as our own. Because why not? What else do they have to take? So that being said, we're going to take a little bit of geekery from Final Fantasy. We're going to take the 1940s and we're going to do it our way. So everything's going to be slightly off, but I still want the idea to be recognizable, which is why we're not doing the red blouse. That being said, as I mentioned, I am going to be doing the pants version of the uniform and the pants version of what women were wearing. Because despite popular belief, women were wearing pants at this point in time. Maybe not in uniforms and formal settings like this, but they were a part of the common wardrobe at the time. And I'm going to use that as justification to refuse to use a skirt pattern for this specific project. And we're done. I loved how this came out, especially where this was a recut of a mock-up for my partner's shirt, who is significantly taller than me. This works perfectly for what we wanted to do. I had enough leftover material to not only make this wonderful necktie, I also had enough to make a themed bag to go on my hip to match the pattern a little bit, while still keeping some of those white mage elements in there. And this is strong enough and solid enough that it can hold my jar of buttons. So this could definitely hold whatever I needed to hold in there, while you're still using up a good chunk of my spare scrap, which again was what we wanted going into this part of the project, especially, was to minimize waste as humanly possible. Now, were there some spots I absolutely couldn't use? Absolutely. Full disclosure, with any sewing project you have, cabbage is going to be inevitable. One day, way down the line, we'll talk about how we can repurpose cabbage into other things to create other useful objects out of what little tiny scraps we have that can't be repurposed into a garment in the way the bag or a necktie can. I like the bag and the necktie as a workaround for still getting the vibes in there without necessarily being one-to-one. Depending on how much resource we have at the end of this project, I may go back and make like a knit sweater and see what we can do with that, so we can still get the aesthetic in there without necessarily, once again, being one-to-one and working with what we already have. This project is going to be a fairly lengthy one, as you can tell by the fact that I've been working on it for 2 months. I will be trying to be more consistent about doing monthly updates rather than bi-monthly, especially because the mock-up for the pants is already done, so I imagine it's going to continue to go quickly in this manner, especially where it's a series of small projects rather than one large project altogether. To be fair, it is all one large project overall, but it's a series of small projects all being rolled into one. And then when the time comes, we will do one big master project in the video, going over in detail what everything was, why decisions were made the way they were made, just doing a much more broad overview than we will do in each of these niche videos. Now, so that I'm not only doing one video a month, because I can understand how that might be frustrating for people who choose to stay on this adventure for the duration, I may at some point in the month of February also be doing a thesis project, essentially explaining the thesis and the theory, as well as the little tidbits of historical fact that feed into the thesis and theory that we're using, just so that we can envision this project a little more fully and get a broader scope of what the lifestyle of those who lived in these times and periods went through and what they did to get through it and to thrive in it as much as anyone possibly can. I don't want to go into the time period that we're going into, which is already so bleak, so rife with tragedy, and just say the tragedy is all there is. I think the majority of us know that we are not going to get through any of life's hardships by only believing in the tragedy, or looking at the tragedy and thinking that that's all there is. You can't heal yourself with that kind of mindset, and you're not going to be in the position to support anyone else either. I've written several long-winded blog posts about how you can't only be the support, but unfortunately, sometimes the support mindset is going to be the one you need the most. Unfortunately, it is what's going to get you through from point A to point B. And I say unfortunately. I mean that somewhat sardonically. It is a pleasure to be a support, whether for yourself, your loved ones, or your community at large. It is a joy to get to be able to help others. But you also need to look at it as genuinely taking care of yourself. And sometimes it's going to be accounting for the resources you have, and sometimes it's going to be meaning finding out how your community can help those resources to stretch. This is going to be a long project. My goal is to, frankly, stretch this project out through as much of the year as humanly possible, so that we have this one big overarching goal to focus on, so that we can get really into the nitty-gritty in between videos. As you've seen with my 3 some odd shorts a day. But it's also to give you breathing room by only doing 1 to 2 videos a day. And bluntly, it is also to give myself breathing room. I know that I have a tendency to let projects, ideas, concepts, things like that get away with me. I tend to go all the way in to a project until something else catches my attention. And then I just kind of lose focus and I move on to the next pretty shiny project that happens to pop into my eye. You might get a little sick of me talking about World War II after a while. I may get a little sick talking about World War II after a while. We're going to find ways to work through that, work through the distractions, work towards creating something meaningful, while still working within our means. Because, and I will say this till I die, the goal of this project is not to get you to look at a perfectly curated, professional looking outfit and thinking, well, I can never do that. My goal with my projects, and this is why I'm being so loose with my rules about what I'm willing to do with them, is to encourage you to think about what's possible. To encourage you to look at what you have available to you, whether they be physical, mental, or financial resources, and say, what's possible? How can I make these stretch? How can I do interesting things with what I already have to achieve the goal that I want to achieve? And also, to encourage a bit of flexibility. To encourage you to feel free to look around at what you want to do. And if you see something that's a little outside your concept, but that you're still in love with, that can be tied in thematically, then yeah, absolutely do that too. We're gonna be learning flexibility together through this project. And regardless of what the next year, the next 2 years, the next 4 years, the next decade look like for us, we're gonna do what we can. And if you get tired of looking at my face or hearing my voice, I would tell you TikTok, because you'll get it in much shorter doses. But I also have an Instagram if you just want pretty pictures and history facts. I have a blog if you just want to see my writing, where I'm a little bit more pointed and direct and less prone to tangents. You are getting the edited version of these, believe it or not, friend. But that's the point. If you still want to engage with me and see what I have to say about things and what I want to learn about, but you don't necessarily want to do it through this medium, I have every other medium under the sun to hang out with you and talk about stuff. Because this entire project is going to be just us hanging out and talking about stuff. And sometimes we'll talk about a fun fact you may or may not have known, or that I learned along the way. And sometimes you're going to hear about how I royally messed up and did something stupid. Because I'm going to mess up and do something stupid. I'm going to have bad ideas. I'm going to not necessarily do everything perfectly. But if you walk away from my videos with anything else, let it be the fact that, you can fuck up. You can do something stupid. You can completely reroute a project once you see the direction that you went in wasn't working for you. And you can dig into your closet and see what other tools you have that you may not have considered the first time. But we're gonna have fun. This is gonna be a marvelous adventure for all of us. Anyway, this is Caitlin with Call to a Mentor, your white mage and support on this journey. And I look forward to seeing you in the next chapter. Bye.